Hello, I'm Dr. David Bray, and live from both Washington, D.C. and all around the world, including our colleagues in Europe and the United Kingdom, we're here to have a great discussion on the strategic standards we need to put in place now so that we can have a data-informed approach to help people return to work soon. Obviously, we're all dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. We here at the Atlantic Council with the Geotech Center are looking at the intersection of geopolitics and technology and data that's impacting both the pandemic response and the recovery. We have a very impressive assembly of experts to talk about this issue today, and this is meant to be a lively discussion. If you're watching us on the web and you have questions via social media, please use the hashtag GoodTechChoices with your question, and we'll strive to answer it here. If we can't answer it during the 60 minutes we have today, we'll make sure to follow up with the panelists and get you answers in the questions that you're asking. Now, first, I want to turn to Declan and then Dame Wendy. Declan, could you first introduce yourself? And we're interested in the question about we lack good data in which local decision makers right now can know when is the right time to return. So what can we do to actually have a more data-informed approach and deal with the data to inform when people can return to work in the middle of the COVID-19 recovery?
Thank you, David. Great to be here. My name is Declan Curran, Managing Director at ISC here in Brussels. David, would you permit me just to address the premise of your question first of all? And I'm dealing with this currently. There's a pervasive sense there will be a back to work. There will be an over. Yeah. I'm beginning to think we won't. There isn't. A lot of folk I'm talking to are now talking about, well, what's the plan for COVID 20, 21, 22? So I think there are still enormous challenges that are not being addressed. For example, regarding the production of a vaccine, the global capacity for vaccines, for a flu vaccine currently is 129 million. By some accounts, for a COVID vaccine, there would need to be the possibility of 4 billion doses. The manufacturing capacity for that doesn't exist. So I think huge structural challenges that need to be addressed that I feel currently aren't sufficiently addressed. But then coming to your point, I think the enormous challenge for data is, from the European perspective, the issue of data compliance. So we're looking here at the evolution of enormous data sets, for example, produced from research activities, the output from research activities. So for those to be valued and valuable at a European level and a global sense, and also contributing to vaccine production wherever, there's going to have to be a compliant regulatory environment to make that happen. I think we're a long way from that.
All right. Thank you, Declan. And I agree. Unfortunately, the data just in the last 2 days is actually informing this discussion that it looks like this is going to be something that's much longer than some people expect. So thank you for that remarks. Dame Wendy, I'll ask you the same. You know, we had a great discussion with you last week. We'll make sure to share the links with everyone on this conversation that we had on data trust. In your perspective, you know, how can we actually have a more data-informed approach about when or if the future of returning to work is completely different? How can we do this in a data-approached way?
Well, there's an awful lot of ways in which data can be used to help us to get back into some semblance of normality. I totally agree with both you and Declan. This is a marathon, not a sprint. It will be a long time before life is anything like normal, and it will probably be a new type of normal. We will have learned to do all sorts of things like this. And maybe we're sorting out climate change as well as the solution to the pandemic as we do this. You would think someone had organized it. I think the main consideration for government is they want to use data. They want to use technical solutions to help the exit strategy because of the issues with the economy. And it's this balance. I've just been watching the press conference from 10 Downing Street. The balance between the economic risks and the health risks are huge. And I don't know how any government is going to make the decisions. I just had today, literally, the Ada Lovelace Institute in the UK produced a very rapid evidence report about this. I will send you the link. It literally is hot off the press to put on the website. And they identify 3 ways in which data will be able to could be used. The digital contact tracing, which is very controversial, symptom tracking apps, which of course rely on people being able to have their symptoms and potential COVID positives verified clinically, and then the immunity certification, which the Chinese are beginning to roll out, and that's all the problems there with we don't know yet whether people will remain immune if they've had the disease. So there are many different ways, and what the Ada Lovelace Institute report talks about is trustworthiness. The ways in which the data can be handled are myriad and very confusing for the ordinary public. Stay safe at home is a very easy message to portray, but it's a hard one for people to stick with for any length of time. Especially as this illness attack is worse for some parts of the population than others. And so we really need to use the data, but it's all about how governments do this. There are some fantastic recommendations in the Ada Lovelace Institute report, such as making sure that governments are completely transparent with what they're doing with the data, what they plan to do with the data at the end, and are not just throwing technical solutions at the data and then seeing if they work, because we really have to think about the longer term here. And we can get onto it later. I don't know what John and Jay are going to say, but of course I would argue that all this data needs to be put into the form of a data trust.
Excellent. Thank you, Dame Wendy. And I agree. And actually, just so you know, was on a conversation with a very large organization on Friday. I won't say the name. And they, on their own, brought up the word data trust. And I said, oh, we have a video you should watch. So this definitely seems to be coming to the forefront. So thank you, Dame Wendy. Now I'd like to turn to Jay Williams. Jay, and then later, John Ackerley. If you could actually help us sort of dive a little bit deeper on what Dame Wendy was talking about, which she gave some examples of where there's data being collected for different purposes. There's questions about how it's being handled with respect, privacy, and integrity. Could you tell us both about what your thoughts are there and maybe what you're doing as well to help address the issues?
Sure. Thanks, everybody. Hi, I'm Jay Williams. I'm the Chief Technology at Quantum Materials Corp. Trust is the key word in this entire thing. We used to, basically shake hands with people and show the open hand because it was a method of showing trust that we didn't have a weapon in our hand. And that's where many of those things started. Well, we can't do that anymore. We're not going to shake in hands anytime soon. And so the question is, how do we create things to be able to reestablish that trust? The other challenge we have is exactly the one that Dame Wendy pointed out, is how do we trust the people that actually have our data, that they do what they say they're going to do with our data and don't decide to do something else with it. We just celebrated the Dutch blowing up a building at one point to prevent information to get out during World War II, because it was very important that people protect their identities. So the good news is that there have been a lot of different organizations working on things like this, the decentralized identifier work at the W3C, verifiable credentials at the W3C, many other people thinking about how to handle this. I've been talking to lots of different states, governments, folks, people. Unfortunately, our policymakers are not exactly up to speed on some of the technological advances that we've been working on for years. I mean, we have, 40-year-old databases that can't issue checks in the United States for people that are getting things returned to them. So it's even more challenging when we start talking about data and trust. But having a lightweight authentication system that integrates with third-party systems and puts data where it needs to be, whether that's in HIPAA-compliant kinds of systems where your physician data already resides, or inside of a new data trust system so that we can handle international transactions. Even if we have an immunity certificate and you're certified for immunity in your local state, what happens when you go to the airport and you're going to travel to another state? What happens then when you go to that place and you decide to travel to another country? Whose immunity certificate applies at what time? Who's the certifying authority to tell you that it's okay for you to be out, or what you should do with your symptoms? So we've got many questions to answer, and hopefully this kind of discussion is one of those starts to be able to say, what are those kind of global structures that we can work within to do things? I mean, just like NATO started to do these kind of things to combat, all kinds of aggression. We've got to do the same thing to combat aggression in the virus world.
Excellent. And thank you, Jay. And I appreciate the NATO analogy, of course, coming from the Atlantic Council. I mean, that's why we were created, and maybe we're needed now. So thank you. And later we're going to get to what you're doing in that screen up there. So once we circle back after we have all the panelists introduce themselves, I'd like if you can then take the lead and tell us what's on your screen. So John, sort of similar question that we asked Jay, but maybe because you've had a lot of experience doing integration with systems in the national security context, other activities as well, and working across these different systems of different ages. So could you talk a little bit about how can we handle data with respect and privacy and do so in a trust that sort of spans multiple different systems?
Great. So then for sure, David, and just a quick intro. So then I'm co-founder, CEO of a Virtue Corporation, which is a data privacy company. Prior to that, I spent a number of years working in government, including at the White House during September 11th as the lead technology policy advisor. And I think there are a lot of lessons to be drawn from that experience. Over the past 20 years, based on, there was a lot of great work, obviously, but a lot of fast decision making that was not necessarily transparent and temporary. So the measures were made permanent. And I think, whether you point at the FISA Accord or at the Patriot Act, we, now 20 years later have a trust deficit. And in order to respond effectively, we've got to figure out to build on the comments that the prior panelists were making, really put into these responses verifiable trust, right? How do you give the public that confidence where they feel comfortable actually sharing their data, knowing that their data is only being used for its intended purposes for that specific period of time? Because I think, as we all know, the natural proclivity is once an entity has access to data, there are all kinds of cool things that you can do with it. And just because one person who is in a position of power during a particular period of time feels very confident that, of course, they will only do the right thing with your data, people change jobs, and you need to have that kind of technical control. And I think we will get into it, later, but it's a combination of identity. There are new ways to have very lightweight encryption and data tagging so that you can actually protect data throughout its life cycle, even if you are running analytics on that data. And so I just love that the term trust has already come up 4 times. I think foundationally that has got to be front and center. And in the US, it would sure be nice, if there was a concrete statement from a foundational principle perspective that the individual, that the patient should be at that center of control. I think that would help us all out a lot.
Excellent. And thank you, John, and thank you for your service as well. And so would now like to go to Daniela, if you could introduce yourself, and if you could actually sort of your perspective, what are you hearing from folks in the industry about these topics? Is there something else we need to include? I know you're also an expert when it comes to food and food logistics and supply chain. So Daniela, if you could share with us your thoughts, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, David. And it's good afternoon to everyone. So I'm a corporate strategist and I'm a former U.S. trade negotiator, and I work across multiple sectors and continents, particularly in the area of agriculture, biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing. So the first thing that I'm hearing across the board is that no one has a crystal ball right now. We're seeing very disparate data, and it's really hard to figure out what the future looks like. And there are a number of different unknowns right now. Some of the major themes that I'm hearing, first is related to food security. It's not a question of whether or not we have enough food, but whether or not we can get the food to the right places. Second, and notwithstanding these early indications that there's a certain flattening of the curve in certain areas of the country, we're very concerned, particularly in rural areas, that we're seeing spikes. And what does that mean? A lot of these areas really don't have proper medical facilities. And how does that affect farm workers? And you've already seen that, particularly in the meat sector. And third, because the agricultural community definitely is in crisis right now, but bear in mind, they've been in crisis for a host of reasons for quite some time. And it's providing a lot of uncertainty, particularly for big agriculture and undertaking the necessary R&D projects. Due to that uncertainty, whether or not it's worth their investment. those are the systems that would make our system more reliable. So those are the major concerns that I'm hearing right now.
Excellent. And I appreciate you touching on that. It's about, we need to also think about patients' health, but we need to make sure people have the food that they need so they can take care of basic needs. So then they can actually feel confident that they can actually start to go back to work once their families are provided for. So Jay, could you tell us what is on that corner of your screen? Could you explain us briefly what it is?
Sure. Actually, I'm always terrible at getting my fingers.
You got the right side.
Direction.
You got it.
But one of the things we discovered early on when we started to go into this new, work from home environment was that there were a lot of things going on. Zoom bombing, all kinds of ways that people were basically leaping into different meetings when they shouldn't be there, being able to wander in the building, so to speak, because, we no longer have those people sitting at the front checking everybody's ID and things like that. So we do a lot of work in anti-counterfeiting. And so we'd actually developed a card that we could use so that people could digitally identify themselves using an external physical card that actually worked with the card that you see on your screen. So we began to change that to work with a mobile device so that everybody could actually have this on their mobile device so that they could either hold it up or identify themselves on it. Then we began including it in these background screens so that people could see it. And that's one of the ways we actually became involved. Not only are quantum dots used in some of the test kits, which we manufacture some of those in the test kits for the virus, but because we were doing anti-counterfeiting, people said, well, is there some way that we could show, our vaccination status and some of our certification status, in those environments as well? So when we're 6 feet away, we could hold up our phone and show that we've got that kind of red, green, yellow, status, so we can see where they are. And I was laughingly telling people that, the next thing we're going to do is integrate with Tinder, so that, when you're trying to plan your dates, you'll know if it's a green, green match or a red, red match, depending on your rest profile.
Excellent. And I guess it also could actually confirm whether or not your date really is a real person or if it's a deep fake that has been generated by an AI. So there's actually value in that as well.
Exactly.
So if I understand, this is a way of at least giving you some control over the presentation about data about yourself, your health, and your identity. So
David, if I could just say one more thing, one
Sure.
of the challenges also around security, right? You don't want to necessarily give everybody your vaccination record, but you do want to tell them that you've been vaccinated or that you've had a test taken and that you're in quarantine for 12 more days based upon that. All of the healthcare data, the specifics of those things can reside where they need to be in the clinician's database and the HIPAA world, all those kind of things. But the pass-fail information from a certifying authority so that a government could say that these 3 tests mean you could go back to work and here's your green badge, that's what we need to make available to be able to get people interacting together again.
Excellent. And that was helpful. And so Dame Wendy, I know we've been talking about data trust and that I think we had a conversation about we shouldn't try to centralize. And it sounds like what Jay is proposing is exactly that. The data remains where it's relevant and brings it together. I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit more about your idea that data trusts work best when they're decentralized versus attempts.
Well, absolutely. And Jay said this incredibly eloquently earlier. I think it was you, Jay. Yes, it was, about how this is a global issue. And you've got to be able to share this data globally, not just in your local area or even in your own country or even on your own continent. And and you mentioned W3CJ. I'm a huge believer in standards. And of course, there's decentralization is so important. We had, when we were talking last week about data trust, you asked about people's personal data and data trust for your own data. And that's the sort of epitome of decentralization where we would all own our data. We're a long way from that. That may come in the future, but you still need people to manage that for you because we're not, I don't think, capable of doing that. But at the moment, in this sort of sense of crisis going into medium to long-term planning, for sure, we are going to need governments and we are going to need companies and we are going to need universities and research labs all to be able to share data to enable people to move around, work out what status they are, and to constantly analyze the data that's being produced. So I'm a firm believer in decentralization, that the people who curate the data have some control over it. And there's all sorts of issues. Jay or somebody, I think it was Jay again, said about, will people move jobs? So absolutely, people, people's change. But actually, some of the data when this data needs to be poured over time and time again so that we understand what's been happening. So I do believe that we need standards, but we need to be able to lighten them up a bit in order to do what needs to be done to get us out of this crisis. And I think that means some of the rigors of like GDPR needs to be lightened up, but in a way that people understand what's happening, so that you can reuse the data, you can share it with other people, but because of needs must. And this huge issue of privacy versus surveillance is a major one for our times. It was anyway. This has just highlighted it. And of course, we watch what's happening in China, but I don't know if I said this last week or on something else that I did, but the key difference with China and a lot of the rest of the world, like in the democracies, is in China, the government asserts the right to look at any data that's collected. We have to, in democracy, protect that, the government doesn't have that right to look at anything. It has to be open and transparent. And in fact, the Ada Lovelace Institute report that I alluded to asks for government to actually make primary legislation, they're talking to the UK government, to say what they will and won't do with the data that's being collected and how long they will keep it for. And
Well, thank you, Dame Wendy. And I think you hit the nail on the head that this is the tension of our era. Is we can't do what other countries are doing and still stay true to our Western ideals. So that is, and being clear about what the intent is.
We might be able to within. That's the dichotomy, is what can we do within our liberal democracies in order to achieve the same effects?
Exactly. So actually, that's a good way to John. John, I think you've actually had a lot of experience dealing with this tension.
He's saying that's a false dichotomy, I think, no?
Well,
I think John actually
to oversimplify, I think it's a very real dichotomy today, but I also think if we think about medium and long-term solutions, if we continue in this dichotomy, we may have a suboptimal outcome. If you just look at the track and trace discussions, it's kind of, to overly generalize, it's either centralized South Korea / you kind of voluntarily opt in, or you're coerced to doing so, or you have decentralized Bluetooth focused, chirping mechanisms that might have very limited utility. So you have either fully useful or totally private. And I think, as we chart our course forward, if the first principle is individual control, can you get to a place where, one of the positive things that did happen after September 11th, and it wasn't perfect, but empowering people to then see something, say something. Is there something empowering where you actually flip the conversation and you get the public excited about sharing their most sensitive data because you put in mechanisms around identity encryption where they have some confidence that their data is not going to be misused? And I think that's the path forward here. It's to turn.
So John, if I could ask you to, because I know you've done a lot of work in this area, so maybe to make it real for our viewers, could you actually talk about what you've been doing already with either differential privacy or what's possible in terms of processing data, even if it's encrypted? That would be great.
Yes. And really the credit goes to the team in that I'm the policy guy. So my brother, Will Ackerley, really the idea goes back 10 years, but it's how do you move that locus of control to the data through tagging data? And it was first implemented in the intelligence community so that sharing organizations could commingle data into a data lake, and there is fine-grained audit and control over, so not just what people can access the data, but what algorithms and systems can access that data. So you apply that outside of the intelligence community context, and I think we are most well known for as a business email and file sharing applications and what the individual user can use. But we're also deploying this from an analytics perspective so that you just have a very easy way to have an audit over what organizations are accessing your data and for how long. And I think the combination of companies coming really together with an open approach to embed that into a system where the control really goes down to what's happening to the encryption keys as a part of that is going to be really important. So the point is, it's not medium long term. Actually, with technology and capabilities today, we can get there quickly.
Good.
And I think what you just described, and Dame Wendy, you get the rejoinder, and then I'll go on but go ahead, go do the
Well, that's
rejoinder.
a data trust.
He did.
Yeah,
I actually was going to say.
We should absolutely coordinate. Yes,
And so
I
actually
love that
think-
concept.
I think if we take what Jay's recommending, what John's recommending, and what Dame Wendy's recommending, I think we have the architecture for a data trust. Jay,
Yeah.
you get a rejoinder
I
real
was just
quick?
going to say, one of the other key parts of this is transparency. And when you combine that with the technologies we've created called the blockchain now, which I'll still call distributed ledgers, we have a way to commit a immutable record, right, that actually any third party can check. And I think people are inclined, if you tell your doctor it's okay to share your information because with another oncologist, for example, because they want a better opinion, you never have a problem with that. You know somebody else is going to see that information. Or if your insurance company reviews that information because they're figuring out how to pay for it, that's perfectly fine. So as long as there's a transparent audit record, to use John's term there, along with the other things that we just talked about, then you've got the ability as a person, you can't manage it yourself, but at least you can look out there and say, well, who's got it? Who's doing what with it? And how can I make sure that those are the right people I want? And how do I pull that back, if I don't want to?
Yep. Exactly right.
Perfect.
All right.
Then it's a real call to action.
John, I think we will come back to you in a moment. I think your audio maybe just clicked out for a second. We'll bring you right back in a second. Let me real quick go to Daniela and Declan to get them in this conversation. We'll come back to you in just a second. Daniela, so Daniela, could we get your thoughts? Because we've been talking about people, but you also were talking a little bit about food and other needs as well. So you've heard all these things that we could do with data for people. What are your thoughts about data for other purposes as well?
Well, I think when we're talking about the food supply chain and concerns with making sure that Americans are not suffering in their food supply, I think we need to bear in mind that pre-COVID, there were 41 million Americans that were already facing hunger and food insecurity. And we have 7 billion mouths in the world to feed, and we have very limited arable land. So in order to fix the issues that we have right now, the very basic necessities for humans, what were the problems that we had before and how do we fix that? I think, first of all, this has brought to light the problems that we have in our food supply chain, getting food to the right people and where it needs to go. I think we also need to address the issue of non-tariff barriers that significantly contribute to the cost of food and to people having barriers to actually getting foods. The other thing I would say is that we have a number of food deserts where people have to travel 20 miles to get to the nearest grocery store. They're surrounded by farmland, but it's inedible crops. And all of this, if you look at it, you need to make data-driven decisions when it comes to agriculture, not political decisions that just are trying to keep certain industries afloat. What is it we need? Who needs to get it? How do we get it there?
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I think you're actually spot on that this is a part where the technology exists, but the policy and the groups that come together to make it happen still need to be forged. So thank you for that. So Declan, from your perspective, I mean, you're seeing what's going on in Europe. We've talked a little bit about GDPR. What are your thoughts about building the coalitions that can be necessary to make this happen?
Yeah, no, that's a huge question. Just before I address it directly, just on the business of, if you like, trust versus regulation, yeah, without getting into the right or wrong, Europe now does have a data protection regulation. That is the environment. The state of California has its privacy legislation as well. And recently, Senator Moran in the US Senate published a data protection regulation as well. And we're finding emerging regulatory environment in Africa. So I think the issue here is, and I'm being rhetorical, so how do you legislate for trust?
Oh dear.
I don't have the answer. Yeah, I think trust is absolutely, but our friends in the legal profession, I mean, that's something that they don't know a lot about. So trust as a social phenomenon is really lacking and has had a very bad press. So as I said, I do not have the answers. I'm just posing the framework there. But they have to be, again, it's not a question of right or wrong, but how do you make it? And also, I think with regard to food security, I mean, I'm not a food specialist, but I am looking here, David, and you're talking about, you know, when people return to work, but that begs the question, you know, will the jobs be there? I mean, there's been a very established discussion over the last number of years on the future of a university. And now that's been telescoped into an overnight discussion. Well, actually, you know, it's online, goodbye, you know.
Yeah.
But, and of course, Dame Wendy's point about the need for federated laboratories and those structured instruments to do the research and development that's a huge challenge, but it has to happen, it has to be enabled, and it's data enabled. And I think that brings me to one point which I'm very interested in, is the role of the state. So states, I'm Irish, you could take in Ireland. I mean, it does what a state does. Yeah, it gives people secure jobs, it enables the environment, bit of defense and whatever. Yeah, regulates on crop production and, you know, pays for hospitals and all that sort of stuff. I think in future that model is, while not becoming redundant, is going to be enormously challenging. Because I did notice, I didn't watch, but the recent Queen's speech was flagged extensively in the media, and I really noticed the emphasis she gave when she said that, you know, she wants future generations to look back on us and know that we've done the right thing. I said, you know, absolutely, yeah, because they're going to have to pay for it. Yeah.
Oh wait.
So there's this is a long game, and I think all of these issues. I mean, looking at the you know, what I'd call the Anglo-Saxon broadcast media recently, you know, again, the whole thing is geared up towards, you know, we're just looking, it's going to be 1 May, 1 June, and then it's all over and we're back to work. You know, not at all. And that comment has been made by a number of you. So I think that the role of the state in addressing these challenges is fundamental, and I think that is going to be a huge question for many states. Well, then who does it? Is it a UN? Is it a what? Is it a federated? I don't have the answer, but I'm saying that is an enormous challenge in terms of, yeah, delivering food. My colleagues in South Africa this morning were telling me that 50% of the population need food assistance today.
So this is not even, this is not like in the future. This is just today.
Yeah, that is absolutely a staggering feat. And then you look at vast, I mean, you know, of course, many of these people were unemployed beforehand. So, you know, they're not going anywhere near a job. Yeah. And of course, but they have data, and of course, their data ultimately will contribute to an analytical interpretation of what has happened. But again, how do you do that? And I certainly think with developing nations or less developed nations, that there can't be a data poverty. They have to be part of the approach. They have to be part of the data solution. But again, how do you get that data? How do you aggregate that data? Against what standards? Who owns it? All these questions, there are no answers. Yeah.
Well, let me try and see if maybe John is back, because I'm going to, sorry to cut you off, Declan, but I'm going to see.
Please.
John, are you back with us?
I think so.
We got you 5 by 5. Yes.
Apologies for that.
So Declan set the stage up for you perfectly, which was, he says, we've got these data trouble now. They're not just about people, but they're also about food. And you had just talked about how you've already been leading the way with what you've been doing at Virtue to make sure people can have differential privacy, differential encryption. But since we now seem to have talked about what you called a data lake, is what Wendy called it, a data trust, how would you go about doing this? If the head of the UN came to you and said, solve this in the next 2 weeks, what would be the top 3 things? I'm going to limit you to just 3 things you would have us start to do.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So I think the, you know, first thing, and this is a, you know, given that I'm sitting in DC, it's sort of a crawl, walk, run approach. Like I mean, there's a global challenge. There's also just in the US. I mean, I've been in numerous conversations, you know, with local efforts across the country that they don't have any approach that is at all unified. So, you know, I think it's tomorrow, the CDC with support from the White House has got to establish a framework for how are we going to think about identity, tagging of data, encryption of data, and where does that locus of control happen? There's a lot just happening on the US side. And then maybe it's crawl, walk. We're doing it with the 5 eyes from an intelligence perspective, from a health standpoint, maybe you start with your allies, right? And you just get things locked down there next. And then there's obviously sort of the broader global challenge, but then that gets into splinternet, it gets into a whole bunch of issues. But when it just comes to the pandemic and getting people back to work and getting people traveling across borders, I think that's the way you have got to think about it.
All right. Thank you, John.
David,
I'm now going to go to. Oh,
Yeah.
so that's the federal. That's how you do the U.S. I'm going to actually now go to John and ask the same question, but say instead of the UN coming to you or the United States president coming to you, let's say the head of the European Commission came to you and said, "We want to do this for Europe." So Jay, maybe if you could give your perspective from the European perspective.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we have spent some time with the UK folks early on trying to figure out some of these things. I just want to comment one thing Declan said first, though. The reason lawyers exist is because of a lack of trust. And so when we talk about the global implications of doing all these things, we're talking about replacing some structures that we've been using since the Magna Carta to be able to establish trust between people and replacing them with some other structure that allows us to do that. So to answer the question, EU, UK, those kind of things directly, the challenges between the way democratic organizations are approaching this and the way some of the less democratic organizations have approached it mean that we've got to start with what we have, right? What we have now that's the most popular thing in the world is social media. And if anybody is willing to expose anything on social media, which they are, it appears to be, you'd think that we could somehow build on that kind of structure immediately, because right now, more people are on the social media platforms than any other single information systems platform in the world. And so while I know, Apple and Google have a partnership, but, we've been talking with them about how we do that around some of the Bluetooth related, pinging, which I don't believe is going to sufficiently help us either. It will get people involved. And one of the things that I'm concerned about, particularly from a credential standpoint, is that people can't even manage their checkbooks. And so expecting people that they're going to manage a digital security wallet somehow to do this, is just beyond comprehension of how that's going to work. So we've got to give them a simple way to do it. We've got to use tools that they already have. So when we talk about authentication, using a Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, tools that are already available out there to integrate into creating a digital token that can then represent their identity for this instance, right? We've got to keep this very focused on exactly what we're trying to do. I've seen people that are trying to have a doctor ask a 39 question, document for somebody to go get a test. That kind of stuff is just not going to work. So even wherever it is, in the general democratic world, we've got to follow the KISS principle, and make this happen.
And for those that are not familiar with it, I'm sure you're using the polite version, which is the keep it simple, silly version. Yes, I got you.
Correct.
So, all right.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Jay. It's really leverage tools that exist today.
We don't have time.
We don't have time
to go.
And don't let
build
the
something
perfect be
else.
the enemy of the good.
Exactly.
Well said. So now I'm going to go to Daniela and then Dame Wendy. Daniela, so Jay tossed out an interesting idea, which is maybe this is actually, maybe it's not, and this is going to Declan's question, maybe it's not nation states riding to the rescue, maybe it's industry. And so from your experience, especially with the food challenges and what Declan just shared about South Africa needs food now, what do you think about, would this be something that industry would do? And if so, what would be the 3 things you would recommend to try and sort of begin to build that coalition to address the food challenges with this whole crisis response?
That's actually a very complicated question. Having come from a regulatory background, I worked at FDA, I worked at EPA, and I worked with USDA and USTR for many years. It's amazing because something as simple as food security seems like such low-hanging fruit, but actually it's just so heavily politicized. And then you add to that, food and generation of food and production of food has become very complex. So right now we're not only at war with a virus, which is affecting food, we're on the heels of a trade war, which affected food. And then that was on the heels of a disinformation war, which was affecting our food supply as well. So yes, an industry-led coalition, we have many of them right now. It's a great idea in theory, but I think that we need to figure out a way to connect government and industries more effectively together. I spent years working in intergovernmental organizations, WHO, WTO, and I see that folks that understand policy and how to drive policy don't necessarily understand how, even if they're experts on agriculture, how it actually works in practice and what are some of the practical business problems that they have day to day. So I think we're going to have to change fundamentally how we do government and how we run intergovernmental organizations.
Wow, excellent. And that's a great response. And that probably deserves another in conversation of itself, but I appreciate you unpacking that, Daniela. Thank you. And Dame Wendy, so given everything you've heard, let's say number 10 Downing Street came to you and asked the same question. What are the top 3 things they should be working on over the next 30 days with data and technology to help us recover from this? What would be the 3 things you'd recommend to number 10 Downing Street?
Well, I'd point them to the Ada Lovelace Institute report, which only came out yesterday. Their recommendations are it's all about accountability mechanisms that should be in primary legislation, privacy by design, not just throwing the technical solutions at them, and transparency. So the 3 things are in there, but I would like to say a couple of other things as well. Declan talked about regulation. When I say I think GDPR should be lightened up, that doesn't mean I don't think we need regulation. We absolutely need regulation, and it's how you enforce and what you enable to happen in when it needs to happen fast, and the reuse of data, which is why I like the data trust approach. I also worry about what Jay kept talking about, what the big companies can do, like Google. I don't want Google to manage this any more than I want any government to have ownership. Google knows far too much about me already. Thank you very much. You know,
I guess Dave Wendy, my point was not that Google could do it, but they're a method to facilitate it, because we have all of the branches and ways of using social media. So it's turning that around so that we can use the kind of thing they've done in a data trust, method to be able to reach people where they live.
Okay, so that's yes, we agree, but we put the checks and balances on the governments by holding them to account. How do we put the checks and balances on the tech companies?
Mm-hmm. John,
how do we do that?
John
has a solution.
Who holds them to account?
That is a whole separate topic as well. But
it's so important.
7 years. No. But well, 2 points. I think it's a great question, Dame Wendy, and I think it's, first of all, I think just very well-meaning, and I think generally positive approach from Google and Apple.
Yeah.
But they are filling they're helping establish the trade-offs for society, because there's a vacuum due to lack of government leadership. And they don't want to be in that position either. They would love leadership about how to integrate their approaches in a data trust model, or have it be sort of foundational in the operating system so that we can make important policy choices on a go-forward basis. But we certainly do not, there is also on the other side, and this is not speaking out of school, there is also, and it's going to continue, a death match for access to data on the part of the hyperscalers. That's where the value is, driving compute, driving access to data. That is not going to change because of COVID. So we have to be very well aware of that.
And John, let me toss out, and this is intended to be a straw man argument, so feel free to take it apart or take it in a different direction. Could we at least have the ability to have audit capability as to what's being done with our data, and possibly have a nonprofit or some other group that's sort of watching what both government and industry is doing with this data as a way of verifying that nobody's doing anything?
Absolutely. Or you could have a federated model where a number of nonprofits are working together, and their technical ways around also how you split keys, and not to go too technical, but you could actually have a federated / decentralized approach where you could have third parties be those real locus of so the loci of a trust. So that's technically possible. That is not going to move super fast over the next month or two, but absolutely, as we get into the next wave, I think that's a very important approach, right? Where it's not just sort of fully decentralized blockchain, but there are ways that you can manage keys, access to keys, where you can give individuals audit and revocability of their data that I think is going to be pretty interesting.
And that
Excellent.
model works transnationally as well, I think.
Yes.
Well, and I was going to say, John, is something you said. A lot of people have been talking about, well, if we could only build this into the operating system. Listen, operating systems are dead. So we need to build this into the network model, right? We have network structures. The network is the operating system now. And so there's no concept of standalone operating system. And the fact that we keep trying to go back to that is only a proprietary cash grab, to put it frankly, for a lot of people. So we can deliver secure distributed cryptography via the network structures that we have today. It doesn't take an operating system owner to participate to make that happen.
It's a good point.
That's just taken me back to the pre-COVID, was there such a time, discussions about 5G in UK and Huawei. So
Yes, and in fact, thank you for seeing that up, because we do have a post that we did about 2 weeks ago at the Geotech Center saying that actually the solution to the geopolitics of 5G is actually just better technology that lets you identify who and what equipment you want to talk to and what you don't want to talk to. But we'll tee that up and we'll invite Dame Wendy back for that one too. Declan and then Daniela. Declan, so you talked about what's the role of the state. And we actually, it seems like we're identifying that maybe the role of the state is possibly being rejuvenated or reborn through technology. We've got about 14 minutes left. If you could do a really short thought about everything you just heard about what's the role of technology in helping rejuvenate how we do governance?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to appreciate, as I would see it, the increasingly challenging role of politics. Simply put, I think in this, politics gets in the way. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean, in terms of policymakers and legislators, their focus really is the next election. And I think that does a lot to impede real strategic thinking and sustainable solutions. So I think that has to change. In terms of the state, as I said, I think the role is going to be practically and politically diminished in future. I think this points to a not post-statal, but supra-statal possibilities. And I think the only game in town for that is UN or UN type forum. But the challenge there, of course, and I hear this from the United Nations people, is that they can get either very good consensus on a particular issue or objective, but then find it very difficult to implement. Or they implement something very well and efficiently, but then can't scale it up. So there are huge inherent challenges in that as well. But I think in the very immediate term, states need to come together across divides. States needs to be able to comply, certainly in terms of broadly data management, speak the same language. And I think that's fundamentally important, because if that doesn't happen, your foundation is wrong, and all the other good stuff you want to do through data is going to be impeded from the get-go. But unfortunately, many key decision makers, I think, don't understand data sufficiently and don't understand what data is doing to enable solutions. And I think therein lies a challenge in terms, we've heard reference to blockchain, artificial intelligence, how will that contribute? But I think we're a long way from doing that unless the data systems are convergent and we have addressed broadly the regulatory environment without getting into the rights and wrongs. And of course, this trust issue is hugely important. But how do you create it? Yeah. And I would think in all of these, it's either global or it's nothing in future. The challenges will remain global. The COVIDs of the future will be global, if anything, and the response has to be sustainable and also has to be global from the get-go, yeah? Not in a step-by-step method, yeah? It has to be.
Well, and to paraphrase something from the American Revolution, which is we either all hang separately or we hang together. And so that's...
That's fundamental. How do you get that message across? Not terribly sure, but that is, anything else is dissipating effort and compounding the challenges we currently face. And this exposes many of those. They're written, whether it's lack of stockpiles or whatever, or capacity, they're there, yeah? And if we don't bring this to the fore, we're going to be looking at that again and again and again, and that's not an option.
Thank you.
If we just classify all data as polling data, then all the politicians would be able to immediately understand it.
Oh, I thought you were going to say that Shakespeare was right, that what we're going to do is use technology to get rid of all the lawyers, but who knows? All right, Daniela, real quick, and then we're going to go to the lightning round. So Daniela, you've heard about everything that people have been talking. Is there something we're missing, or is there something that gives you hope, real quick, before we go to the lightning round?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I see this kind of as a war and virus, and much like many wars, it gives you an opportunity to start with a blank slate and rebuild. We've been talking for years and years and years. There have been papers written about how to reform government, how to reform our systems, and then there are all these obstacles to getting there. One thing that concerns me right now, and Declan, you were touching on it, and these intergovernmental organizations, UN-like, there are a lot of problems with them. And David, you put my back against the wall a little bit to share with you my innermost thoughts on these issues. I think we need major reform, because right now there's a complete disconnect between our policies and practical actualities. And how do we bridge that without, getting to areas where we're being unethical? I mean, just look right now, we have so much black and white thinking with this anti-industry thinking. And if you look at a lot of European-based entities, and I love EU and European, so with all due respect, they don't want any taint of industry. So you have a lot of people making the decisions that have absolutely no background on how things actually work. And this is part of, and Dame Wendy touched upon that as well. This is part of the problem, and we need to address this if we want to find actual practicable, feasible solutions.
So we need to recognize there are experts across sectors and across nations, and if we limit ourselves to the sectors or nations we involve, we will not be as smart as we can in the recovery.
The issues are too complex. We need to pull from a large swath of industry and get a lot of expert opinions.
Very well said. All right, so panelists, we're now about nine minutes remaining. We're now going to go to the lightning round, where basically you get to do up to 3 tweets, and it's the new tweet limit, so it's 240 characters, up to 3 tweets, and then we're going to have to move on to the next one as to what are your takeaways from everything we discussed today. And I first want to thank you all. This has been an amazing, energetic conversation. I feel like we've actually packed an hour with about 3 hours of worth of thoughts here, recognizing that this is an opportunity to redesign how we work, that we need to recognize that the way we get back to work may be completely different than it was before COVID, and we need to address fundamental needs, both health, but also food, safety, and everything necessary to help people pull through this crisis globally. So first, on the giving of their 3 tweets, I'm going to turn first to John. You can wear whatever hat you want, but what would be the 3 tweet links takeaways that you would recommend from this? And then I'll go on from there to Dame Wendy, and we'll proceed.
Right. So it starts with share something, save someone. So with trust, with a technology today, and people working together, we can inspire people to share more, and that will get us back to work faster.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Dame Wendy, what would be your takeaways?
That was 1 tweet, wasn't it?
He did 1 tweet, but he elaborated. It was like...
And also, takeaway 2, Dame Wendy and Jay, we needed to have a follow-up contact.
Yes. That would be fabulous. Yes. And I think I always said that this was at last a use for blockchain.
Yes, at last we found it.
Well,
because I do agree that this is a way. I mean, I've always thought the technology. So I think, yeah. I don't know if I've got 3, but basically, I think the most important thing, I would echo John, the sharing. To share is so we have to, and I loved. What was your phrase, John? To share to save someone. Yep. Yes. I think that's like we've been saying, stay at home, save lives. This is about share data to save lives. And we have to find ways to do that do not compromise our liberties that we've been fought for long and hard. And then I would move on to say decentralize. get people, make sure governments do not fall into the trap of automatically trying to centralize everything as being quicker, more efficient to solve a problem. Decentralization is so important. And I would add to that, and the things Daniela's been saying about food, and South Africa's been on the news today, but you think of all the countries in the world where food is a huge problem already, and then they're going to be struck with this virus and they don't have health services. If we think we're suffering, other countries are just going to suffer so badly. And I was watching Bill Gates the other day talking about how a global globalization, global approach is needed in the way that philanthropists are donating their funding. He always takes that tack, and it's very powerful here. But the point I wanted to make is that if you're talking about global solutions, global standards, global regulations, then China is 20% of the world, if not more. You cannot ignore them. We have to work, somehow find a way to work with China in all this, because they are so powerful in terms of all sorts of supply chains, and we've learned that in this crisis we can't get the PPE without going to China. So right. So we have to build bridges there somehow.
Thank you. And on that note, actually, I hope to share all your remarks that you've had here today for each of you. We are doing a separate project with the Atlantic Council in working with the Rockefeller Foundation to understand data and AI efforts in China. It was actually launched before COVID-19. We did meet with people in China as well as in Europe, with both European and Chinese experts there as well. And I think you hit the nail on the head is we have to find ways to work together, because as you said, they're 20% of the solution here.
But they have more than 20% of the effect, actually, because of the supply chain thing.
Agreed. Very well said. All right, next I'm going to go on to Jay, and then I'm going to go to Danielle, and then Declan, you get the last word. Jay, what would be your 3 tweets if you were tweeting possibly to Gates or Bezos or anybody that sort of, what are recommendations here?
Well, I think one of the first things we have to remember is that only about 52% of the world's actually on the internet. And so when we start talking about all these things here in Texas, for example, when I talk to people, one of the things that we have a big issue with is that many of the people that we need to do this with don't have smartphones. They're not connected. They're migrant workers. They're immigrants. They're folks that simply don't have a way to do that. We're working on another project to try and deal with the homeless and people that are experiencing homelessness. It's very challenging it's easy for us to talk about this beautiful card up in the corner, when all of us have these kind of things, but how do we convert that into a real actionable tool that actually works through the provider systems, through other kinds of things to be able to do it? How are first responders going to figure out if somebody has a virus when they show up to try and do something for them? Things like that. So the first tweet would be, consider all of those that you have to share and support that don't have your technological advantages. So how do we build these platforms to be able to work and survive and suffice for those kind of people too? And then the second tweet, because I'd only have 2, would be an expansion on the share. We have to do everything we can to remember we're a community. This self-isolation, the things that we've been doing, fascinatingly enough, I think we've developed broader communities through the work from home kinds of things that we've done, because we've now got to see what's in the background at everybody's house. So hence I have a virtual background, because I don't want you to see all my dirty socks. But the fact is that it's helped us create stronger bonds, because we see the personal nature of everyone. But to some degree, we're sacrificing our local sense of community to be able to do that. And we have to do everything we can, as we're talking about data lakes and technology and all of those things, to preserve the humanity of the communities and things that we have. Because if we win on all those fronts and we lose that, I'm not sure where we'll be.
Right. Preserve our sense of community and shared connectedness. All right, Daniela, you're now next in lightning round. And then Declan, you'll finally have the last word. We've got about 3 minutes left.
So I'm a bit of a Luddite. I don't have Twitter. So my first tweet would probably be something silly like, "Hi, Mom." But other than that, the first thing I would say is we need to make data-driven decisions based on valid and discernible data. That's the first thing. The second thing, like Jay, it hit on this, that we need to resist this urge to isolate, and we need to come together to resolve this issue. And the third thing, which harkens back to your earlier question, is there silver lining? I hear all the time about people talking about, oh, technology, pretty soon it's going to be telling us what to do. We're the creators of this technology. If we can send a man to the moon, if we can send satellites into outer space, we can resolve this too, and we can also control the input and the ethics around it.
Very
That's
well said.
longer than a tweet, isn't it? Sorry.
No, actually, that I think you fit it in. So you're good. And actually, it was very well said. We can create the reality we want. Okay, Declan, we've got 1.5 minutes left. We're a little bit over time, but we'll give you an extra 90 seconds. What's your closing thoughts for the lightning round?
One point that I mentioned at the beginning is, there is no over. I think people need to understand that, particularly policymakers. I think that's hugely important. The next point related to that is, yeah, there needs to be a realization of the importance in trust. And through this, we can be sustained. We've talked a lot about food and thereby, thinking of all the people who are not getting enough food. But remember, it's not exactly half the world is starving and the other half is obese. But remember, there's huge challenges on the overconsumption side as well. And that brings us also brings me to a point that we've got to understand the enormously complex range of problems. Dane, when you refer to the environment, these are still there. These aren't going away. So it's not just a problem, it's multiple problems, yeah? And data has a role in all of this. And finally, my final point would be, there needs to be, it's a simplistic point, but nevertheless, there needs to be a global policy solution.
Very well said. Well, I want to thank you all. This has been a most engaging and insightful conversation. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy days. We at the Atlantic Council truly appreciate the opportunity to advance this. I hope there are either government leaders or private sector leaders that are seeing this either live or when we have the replays available on our website, because we would really like to help make this happen. And you all have renewed my faith that we can, in the midst of all this, figure out solutions that are both local and global with the response. With that, thank you all for being positive change agents. Onwards and upwards together.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
David.